Long before faith felt hard in the modern world, it felt hard on a quiet road in ancient times, where Jesus walked without certainty of comfort, applause, or safety. He stepped into a world already exhausted by power, religion, and fear, and instead of offering quick solutions, he offered a way of living that asked people to trust what they could not always see. He was surrounded by crowds, yet often felt alone. He performed miracles, yet was doubted. He spoke of peace, yet lived under constant threat. From the very beginning, faith was never designed to be easy. It was designed to be deep. Jesus did not enter a calm world. He entered a divided one. People wanted signs, certainty, and control, but he spoke of surrender. They wanted instant rescue, but he spoke of patience. They wanted proof, but he told stories that demanded reflection instead of answers. Even those closest to him struggled to understand. Faith was not handed to them fully formed, it was something they slowly learned to carry. And if faith felt heavy even in the presence of Jesus, it should not surprise us that it feels heavy now. There were moments when Jesus himself withdrew into silence, praying alone in the dark, carrying questions that had no immediate resolution. That alone tells us something important. Faith was never meant to eliminate struggle. It was meant to teach how to remain rooted within it. Jesus did not promise clarity at every step. He promised presence. He did not remove uncertainty. He walked through it. This is where the modern struggle begins. Because the world we live in now is louder, faster, and more demanding than ever, but the soul still longs for the same things it always has. Meaning, belonging, hope, truth. We are surrounded by information, yet starved for wisdom. We are connected constantly, yet feel deeply alone. Faith feels harder today not because it has become weaker, but because it refuses to change its nature to match a world that avoids silence and resists surrender. Jesus spoke about seeds growing unseen beneath the soil, about faith as small as a mustard seed, about trust forming slowly, often invisibly. The modern world wants visible results, instant growth, measurable success. Faith still grows underground. And anything that grows underground is often mistaken for absence. In a culture that demands answers, Jesus offered questions. In a society obsessed with strength, he chose vulnerability. In moments when power was within reach, he stepped back. Faith, through his life, was not about winning arguments or proving superiority. It was about learning how to live fully without being ruled by fear. That message feels uncomfortable in a world that worships control. Today, faith feels hard because we are taught to trust algorithms more than intuition, productivity more than purpose, certainty more than hope. Faith asks us to slow down in a world that never stops. It asks us to listen when everything around us is shouting. It asks us to believe that life has meaning even when suffering refuses to make sense. Faith feels heavy because we expected it to shield us from pain, when it was meant to walk with us through it. Jesus never promised his followers an easy life. He promised them a meaningful one. He spoke openly about loss, endurance, and sacrifice, not to glorify suffering, but to show that suffering does not have the final word. The modern world has mastered distraction. Faith requires attention. The modern world rewards appearances. Faith requires honesty. The modern world avoids discomfort. Faith transforms it. This tension is why belief feels exhausting at times. It is not failing, it is resisting being reshaped into something shallow. When Jesus spoke of rest, it was not the kind sold by entertainment or escape. It was rest for the soul, a deep grounding that does not disappear when circumstances change. That kind of rest is rare today. We are busy but not fulfilled. Informed but not wise. Surrounded but not supported. Faith addresses this quiet emptiness, but it does so slowly, gently, without spectacle. Faith also feels hard because modern life encourages us to stand alone, while faith reminds us that we were never meant to. Jesus gathered people, not because they were certain, but because they were willing. Faith has always been communal, carried together when individual strength runs out. When belief becomes isolated, it feels fragile. When it is shared, it becomes resilient. There is a moment in every life when faith shifts from inherited to chosen. That moment often comes through doubt, disappointment, or silence. The modern world labels that moment as failure. Faith calls it growth. Jesus never condemned doubt, he met people inside it. He did not demand perfect belief, he honored honest seeking. Faith feels hard today because it no longer survives on habit alone. It must be chosen deliberately, again and again, often without reassurance. But that chosen faith carries a depth that easy belief never could. It becomes less about answers and more about orientation, less about certainty and more about trust. Jesus did not come to make life easier to understand. He came to make it possible to live meaningfully even when it isn't. That truth has not changed. The world has simply become louder, and the quiet voice of faith now requires intention to hear. If faith feels heavy in the modern world, it does not mean you are losing it. It may mean you are carrying it honestly, without illusions, without shortcuts, without borrowed certainty. And that kind of faith, the kind that survives noise, doubt, and exhaustion, is the same faith that has carried humanity through every age before this one. Faith feels harder today not because humans have lost their ability to believe, but because the world has become louder than the soul. Once upon a time, people looked at the night sky and felt small. Today, we look at screens and feel empty. The stars used to raise questions that had no answers, and faith lived comfortably inside that mystery. Now, we live in a culture that promises answers to everything, and yet somehow leaves us more confused than ever. The modern world has trained us to believe that if something cannot be explained instantly, measured precisely, or proven publicly, then it must not be real. Faith does not survive well under constant interrogation, yet interrogation has become our default state of mind. We scroll through thousands of opinions before breakfast. We consume more information in a single day than our ancestors encountered in a lifetime. And yet, with all this knowledge, the deepest questions remain untouched. Who am I really? Why do I exist? What gives suffering meaning? Where do hope and courage come from when everything falls apart? Faith used to be the place where these questions could rest without being rushed. Today, questions are treated like problems that need quick solutions, not truths that need time. And faith, which grows slowly, now feels incompatible with a world addicted to speed. There was a time when believing meant belonging. Faith was not just something you thought about, it was something you lived inside of. Stories, rituals, songs, and shared silence connected people to something larger than themselves. In the modern world, belief has been reduced to a private opinion, something you keep hidden so you don't offend, don't argue, don't stand out. When faith becomes lonely, it becomes fragile. Doubt grows louder when there is no community to hold it, and modern life has quietly replaced shared meaning with individual survival. Another reason faith feels heavy today is because modern culture worships control. We are told that if we plan hard enough, work smart enough, optimize enough, we can avoid pain. Faith says something very different. Faith says pain will come anyway, and meaning matters more than control. That message feels threatening in a world that sells certainty as safety. When suffering appears, as it always does, many people feel betrayed by faith rather than invited deeper into it. They were taught that belief would protect them, not transform them. Faith also struggles in a culture obsessed with performance. Social media has turned life into a stage. We are constantly measuring ourselves against carefully edited versions of other people's lives. When faith is viewed through that lens, it starts to feel like another test we are failing. Why am I still anxious if I believe? Why am I still struggling if I'm faithful? Why does everyone else seem happier than me? What we forget is that faith was never about appearing strong. Faith was about learning how to stand honestly in weakness. The modern world rewards looking successful, not being truthful. There is a quiet exhaustion that comes from always needing to appear certain. Faith does not require certainty, but modern debates demand it. You are expected to defend your beliefs like arguments, as if faith were a political position instead of a lived relationship with mystery. Over time, this pressure makes faith feel defensive instead of nourishing. People don't walk away from faith because they stop believing. They walk away because belief becomes emotionally unsafe in a world that mocks vulnerability. Distraction is another silent thief. The human mind was never designed to be stimulated every second. Faith requires stillness, and stillness now feels uncomfortable. Silence confronts us with thoughts we would rather avoid. Doubt, grief, longing, regret all surface when noise disappears. So we keep the noise on. But faith does not shout over chaos. Faith whispers. And when the whisper is drowned out long enough, we begin to assume it is gone. There is also the modern misunderstanding that faith must compete with science, logic, and progress. This false conflict has made many people feel intellectually ashamed of belief. Yet faith was never meant to replace reason, it was meant to answer questions reason cannot. Science can explain how the universe works, but it cannot explain why love hurts, why beauty moves us, or why hope persists against logic. Faith lives in the space where explanation ends and meaning begins. But modern culture often dismisses that space as weakness instead of wisdom. Faith feels harder because pain feels sharper in a world that promises happiness. When life is marketed as endless comfort, suffering feels like failure. Faith doesn't remove suffering, but it gives it language. Without faith, pain is random. With faith, pain can still hurt deeply, but it does not have the final word. The modern world avoids pain at all costs, yet paradoxically produces more anxiety, loneliness, and despair. Faith does not offer escape from pain, it offers companionship through it. That is a quieter promise, and quieter promises are harder to sell. We also live in a time where moral clarity feels blurry. Everything is relative, negotiable, customizable. Faith often asks for commitment in a culture allergic to permanence. Choosing one path feels risky when you're told you should keep all options open. Faith requires rooting yourself in something unseen, and modern life teaches us to stay flexible, detached, uncommitted. Rootlessness feels like freedom at first, but over time it becomes exhaustion. Faith feels hard because modern success leaves little room for wonder. We are encouraged to conquer, optimize, and dominate, not to kneel in awe. Wonder slows you down. Wonder reminds you that you are not the center of the universe. Faith grows naturally in wonder, but wonder disappears when life becomes only about efficiency. When everything must be useful, nothing is sacred. Yet here is the surprising truth many never realize. Faith becomes most powerful precisely when it feels hardest. Easy faith depends on circumstances. Deep faith survives despite them. The struggle itself is not proof of failure, it is often proof of growth. Questioning does not destroy faith, unexamined belief does. A faith that has wrestled with doubt is stronger than a faith that has never been tested. In the modern world, faith looks different. It does not always look like confidence. Sometimes it looks like choosing hope when cynicism feels smarter. Sometimes it looks like continuing to love when retreat would be easier. Sometimes it looks like trusting meaning even when answers refuse to come. Faith today is not about certainty, it is about courage. The courage to live as if life has purpose even when evidence feels incomplete. If faith feels heavy right now, it may be because you are carrying it honestly. You are no longer relying on borrowed beliefs or inherited assumptions. You are discovering what faith actually means to you. That process is uncomfortable, but it is also authentic. Faith that survives the modern world is not loud. It does not demand attention. It does not need to win arguments. It simply continues to exist quietly inside people who refuse to give up on meaning. In a world obsessed with what can be seen, faith dares to trust what is unseen. In a culture addicted to speed, faith insists on patience. In an age of noise, faith chooses silence. And in a time where everything is temporary, faith dares to believe that some things are eternal. Faith feels hard today because it asks us to slow down when everything else tells us to run. It asks us to listen when everything else demands we speak. It asks us to surrender control in a world that worships power. And yet, for those who stay, for those who continue, faith becomes not an escape from reality, but a deeper way of facing it. The modern world will keep changing. Trends will rise and fall. Certainties will collapse. But the human hunger for meaning will remain. Faith does not disappear in modern times, it evolves. It sheds shallow forms and becomes quieter, stronger, and more honest. It stops being about answers and becomes about presence. And sometimes, in the middle of doubt, silence, and struggle, that presence is enough to carry us forward. Faith continues to feel hard because the modern world quietly teaches us to trust ourselves above everything else. We are told that self-reliance is strength, that needing anything beyond our own mind is weakness. Faith, however, begins where self-sufficiency ends. It begins at the edge of our limits, where effort alone cannot carry us anymore. That is an uncomfortable place for a culture that celebrates independence above all else. To admit the need for faith today feels like admitting incompleteness, and the modern ego resists that truth with everything it has. There is also a deep fear of being wrong. The internet never forgets. Opinions are permanent, screenshots are eternal, and mistakes are amplified. Faith requires humility, the willingness to say, I don't know everything. But modern life punishes uncertainty. It rewards strong stances, quick judgments, and confident declarations. In such an environment, faith can feel dangerous, because it allows room for mystery. And mystery feels risky when the world demands precision. Faith becomes even heavier when suffering collides with comparison. Someone else survives what breaks you, and suddenly your faith feels smaller. Someone else finds peace faster, and you wonder what you're doing wrong. But faith was never meant to be competitive. Pain is not a race, and healing is not a performance. The modern world constantly places us on invisible leaderboards, but faith does not measure worth by progress. It measures depth by honesty. Another quiet reason faith feels difficult is because hope itself has become exhausting. We have been disappointed too many times. Promises were broken. Leaders failed. Systems collapsed. Over time, skepticism feels safer than belief. Hope feels risky when you have already been let down. Faith asks you to hope anyway. Not because everything will turn out fine, but because despair slowly erodes the soul. Faith is not optimism, it is resilience with a reason. We often forget that doubt has always existed. Even the most devoted believers in history wrestled with silence, absence, and fear. The difference today is that doubt is no longer something you walk through, it is something you live inside. The modern world feeds doubt constantly, not as a question, but as an identity. You are encouraged to define yourself by what you reject rather than what you seek. Faith, however, is a seeking posture. It is a reaching, not a rejecting. And reaching requires vulnerability. Faith feels heavier because time itself feels fractured. We live in constant anticipation of the next moment, the next update, the next achievement. Faith invites presence. It asks you to inhabit the now, even when now feels uncomfortable. Modern life teaches escape. Faith teaches endurance. Endurance is not glamorous, but it is transformative. There is also the pain of unanswered prayers. Not delayed answers, not different answers, but silence. Silence hurts more than rejection. Silence makes faith feel like speaking into a void. Yet silence has always been part of faith's language. Growth often happens invisibly. Seeds break underground before they rise. The modern world wants instant results, but faith unfolds on a timeline we cannot control. Faith struggles because modern storytelling has changed. Stories used to teach us about sacrifice, patience, and perseverance. Now many stories promise shortcuts, sudden success, and effortless happiness. Faith tells a longer story, one where meaning emerges slowly and often through struggle. Long stories are harder to sell in a short attention world. There is also the quiet grief of outgrowing inherited beliefs. Many people feel lost not because they stopped believing, but because what they were taught no longer fits the complexity of their lived experience. Faith feels hard in this space because it is being rebuilt rather than abandoned. Reconstruction is painful. But it is also a sign of maturity. A faith that evolves is not weaker, it is more honest. Faith in the modern world often becomes quieter, less performative, less visible. And that can feel lonely. But quiet faith has always been the kind that lasts. Loud belief can attract attention, but quiet belief sustains life. It shows up in small acts of kindness, in choosing compassion over bitterness, in refusing to let cynicism have the final word. Faith feels hard because it asks us to forgive in a culture that profits from outrage. It asks us to slow down in a culture addicted to urgency. It asks us to listen in a culture that never stops talking. It asks us to trust in a culture built on skepticism. None of this is easy. But difficulty does not mean futility. Resistance does not mean absence. Perhaps faith feels hard today because it is no longer inherited automatically. It must be chosen. Chosen again and again in small moments. Chosen when life makes no sense. Chosen when answers do not come. Chosen when doubt feels louder than belief. And that kind of faith, chosen freely rather than assumed, carries a depth that easy belief never could. Faith does not promise clarity. It promises companionship. It does not remove fear. It gives courage meaning. It does not explain life away. It gives life a reason to be faced fully. And in a modern world that often feels overwhelming, faith becomes less about knowing and more about trusting the journey itself. If you are still standing in faith despite the noise, despite the doubts, despite the fatigue, that is not weakness. That is strength reshaped. Faith today is not naive. It is brave. It chooses to believe that love is real, that meaning matters, and that hope is not foolish, even when the world insists otherwise. And maybe that is why faith feels hard in the modern world. Because it refuses to shrink into convenience. Because it refuses to fit into algorithms. Because it still asks ancient questions in a digital age. And because, even now, it continues to call the human heart towards something deeper than comfort, something stronger than fear, and something more enduring than doubt. Faith keeps feeling hard because the modern world subtly teaches us that vulnerability is a flaw. We are told to be strong, composed, efficient, and productive at all times. Faith, however, often begins at the moment when strength runs out. It begins in the quiet admission that we cannot carry everything alone. That admission goes against the grain of a culture that glorifies self-made identities. To lean into faith today feels like stepping against a powerful current, and swimming upstream is always exhausting. There is also a silent pressure to have everything figured out early. Careers, relationships, beliefs, identities, everything must be defined, labeled, optimized. Faith resists premature conclusions. It allows seasons of not knowing. It accepts that understanding unfolds slowly. But the modern world treats uncertainty like a disease that must be cured immediately. Living inside unanswered questions feels irresponsible in a culture that prizes certainty, yet faith has always lived comfortably inside questions. Faith feels heavier because modern life fragments our attention. Our days are divided into notifications, deadlines, and endless micro-decisions. We are rarely fully present anywhere. Faith requires wholeness of attention, even if only for brief moments. A scattered mind struggles to sense meaning. When life feels fragmented, faith can feel distant, not because it has disappeared, but because our awareness is stretched too thin to notice it. Another unspoken struggle is disappointment with institutions. Many people confuse faith with the systems that represent it. When institutions fail, trust collapses, and faith is often buried under that collapse. But faith itself is not an institution. It is a human response to mystery, meaning, and transcendence. When structures crumble, faith is forced to stand on its own. That process feels like loss, but it can also be purification. Faith also becomes difficult when life exposes unfairness. You do everything right, and things still fall apart. Others seem careless and yet thrive. The modern world magnifies these contradictions daily. Without faith, injustice feels meaningless. With faith, injustice is still painful, but it is not final. Faith insists that meaning is larger than immediate outcomes, and that insistence feels fragile when the world rewards what is loud, ruthless, and fast. There is a unique loneliness in modern belief. In earlier times, disbelief was rare. Today, belief itself can feel like the odd position. When faith becomes countercultural, it demands courage rather than conformity. Choosing faith now often means choosing it quietly, without applause, without validation, sometimes without understanding from others. That solitude can feel heavy, but it also reveals the depth of one's convictions. Faith struggles because we are tired. Emotionally, mentally, spiritually. Burnout dulls wonder. Exhaustion makes hope feel like work. Faith asks for patience when patience feels depleted. Yet faith does not demand perfection, it meets us in fatigue. It does not require constant enthusiasm, it allows weary persistence. Modern culture celebrates hustle, but faith honors rest. When rest is neglected, faith becomes harder to carry. Faith also feels difficult because pain today is often internalized rather than shared. We hide our struggles behind competence. Faith invites honesty, but honesty feels risky when everyone else seems fine. When suffering becomes invisible, faith becomes private. And private faith, while still real, can feel isolated. There is also the modern temptation to reduce everything to psychology. While understanding the mind is valuable, it cannot fully explain longing, transcendence, or the human pull toward meaning beyond survival. Faith addresses these deeper currents. But when everything is reduced to mechanisms and coping strategies, faith can feel unnecessary or outdated. Yet even in the most advanced societies, people still ache for purpose. That ache has not evolved away. Faith feels hard because modern life offers endless substitutes. Entertainment replaces joy. Productivity replaces purpose. Validation replaces belonging. None of these are evil, but none of them are sufficient. Faith becomes difficult when substitutes promise fulfillment but quietly fail to deliver it. Disillusionment then sets in, not just with the substitutes, but with the idea of meaning itself. Faith asks us to sit with that disillusionment long enough to discover what truly satisfies. Another subtle challenge is the fear of being judged. Faith is often misrepresented as ignorance or weakness. Many people keep their beliefs hidden to avoid ridicule. Over time, hiding erodes confidence. Faith thrives in honesty, not secrecy. When belief must be concealed, it begins to feel fragile even to the one holding it. Faith also feels harder because modern life rarely pauses. Reflection requires space. Faith grows in reflection. Without pauses, growth becomes shallow. The world encourages constant motion, but meaning requires moments of stillness. When those moments disappear, faith feels distant, even though it is still present. Perhaps one of the hardest truths is this: faith feels hard because it asks us to change. Not instantly, not perfectly, but gradually. The modern world often promises transformation without discomfort. Faith promises transformation through honesty. That honesty can be painful. It reveals fears, attachments, and illusions we would rather ignore. Growth is uncomfortable, and faith is a path of growth. Yet even here, faith endures. It endures not by overpowering doubt, but by walking alongside it. It endures not by silencing questions, but by holding them gently. Faith does not require certainty to survive. It requires sincerity. Faith in the modern world may never feel easy again. But easy faith was never the goal. Meaningful faith is forged under pressure. It deepens through struggle. It becomes less about answers and more about orientation, how you face the world, how you treat others, how you carry suffering, how you choose hope. And maybe that is the quiet miracle. That even now, in a distracted, skeptical, exhausted age, faith still survives. It survives in people who refuse to give up on meaning. In people who continue to hope quietly. In people who live as if love matters, even when evidence feels thin. If faith feels hard, you are not broken. You are awake. You are paying attention. And faith, in its truest form, has always belonged to those willing to stay awake to life as it really is. Faith continues to feel hard because the modern world has blurred the line between identity and belief. People are no longer just asked what they believe, but who they are because of it. Disagreement feels personal now. Questions feel threatening. In such an environment, faith can feel like a fragile possession rather than a living relationship. Many people fear losing relationships more than losing belief, so faith slowly retreats inward, becoming quiet not out of humility, but out of self-protection. Another weight comes from the modern obsession with outcomes. Everything must lead somewhere visible. Growth must be measurable. Success must be obvious. Faith, however, works invisibly most of the time. It shapes character long before it changes circumstances. It teaches patience before it offers relief. In a results-driven culture, invisible growth feels pointless, and faith begins to feel unrewarding, even though it is doing its deepest work beneath the surface. Faith also struggles because modern narratives often frame suffering as meaningless. When pain is seen only as something to eliminate, not something to understand, faith feels unnecessary. Yet humans have always needed a way to carry suffering without being destroyed by it. Faith offers that way, not by glorifying pain, but by refusing to let pain define the entire story. In a world that wants immediate comfort, this longer perspective feels unbearable at times. There is also the quiet erosion of patience. Waiting used to be part of life. Now waiting feels like failure. Faith is inseparable from waiting. Waiting for clarity. Waiting for healing. Waiting for meaning to unfold. When patience disappears, faith feels like a burden rather than a companion. The soul is forced to move faster than it was designed to go. Faith feels heavier because modern life often isolates us at the exact moments we need others most. We are connected digitally but disconnected emotionally. Faith was never meant to be practiced alone. It was meant to be shared through presence, touch, listening, and mutual endurance. When belief becomes solitary, it feels brittle, even if it is sincere. Another struggle is the modern fear of commitment. Everything is reversible now. Beliefs, relationships, identities, all are expected to remain flexible. Faith asks for commitment without guarantees. It asks you to stay even when doubt appears. That kind of staying feels risky in a culture that values exit strategies. Yet depth has always required commitment, and faith is no exception. Faith also feels hard because modern life constantly interrupts grief. There is no space to mourn fully, to sit with loss, to let sorrow teach. Faith often speaks most clearly in grief, but grief requires slowness. When grief is rushed, faith feels silent. The soul does not heal on a schedule, and faith does not either. There is a subtle shame many carry for still believing. As if belief were childish, outdated, or naive. This shame does not come from faith itself, but from cultural messaging that equates intelligence with skepticism. Yet some of the deepest thinkers in history held faith alongside reason. The modern world often forgets that wisdom is not the same as doubt, and certainty is not the same as truth. Faith feels hard because it demands honesty rather than performance. It does not allow us to hide behind achievements or distractions forever. It eventually asks us to face our fears, our wounds, and our contradictions. That confrontation can feel overwhelming. But avoidance slowly hollows life out. Faith insists on wholeness, even when wholeness requires discomfort. And still, despite all of this, faith remains. It remains not as a loud declaration, but as a quiet decision repeated daily. A decision to care when indifference feels easier. A decision to forgive when resentment feels justified. A decision to hope when cynicism feels logical. These choices rarely go viral. They rarely attract attention. But they shape lives. Faith today may not look like it did in the past. It may be smaller, quieter, less certain. But smaller does not mean weaker. Quiet does not mean absent. Faith adapts because humans adapt. It moves inward when it is pushed outward. It deepens when it can no longer rely on habit or tradition alone. Perhaps faith feels hard because it is being refined. Stripped of illusions. Freed from shallow promises. Returned to its core purpose, helping humans live meaningfully in an uncertain world. When faith no longer promises easy answers, it becomes capable of holding difficult truths. Faith does not compete with the modern world, it responds to it. It responds to loneliness with presence, to anxiety with trust, to meaninglessness with purpose, to fragmentation with wholeness. These responses are subtle, but they are powerful. If you are still carrying faith through doubt, exhaustion, and confusion, you are participating in something ancient and resilient. You are not behind. You are not weak. You are doing what humans have always done when the world becomes overwhelming. You are searching for meaning that goes deeper than circumstance. Faith has never been about escaping the modern world. It has always been about learning how to live inside it without losing your soul. Faith continues forward from the life of Jesus into every age where the world grows louder than the heart. After his words faded into history, his message did not become easier to live, it became harder. Followers were no longer walking beside him, they were walking by memory, by trust, by conviction formed in silence. That is where faith has always done its deepest work. Not in moments of spectacle, but in ordinary days where belief must survive without visible proof. The modern world mirrors the same tension Jesus faced, only amplified. People still ask for signs. They still want certainty. They still hope faith will remove discomfort instead of reshaping how discomfort is carried. And when faith does not deliver control, many assume it has failed. But faith was never designed to control life. It was designed to anchor it. Jesus spoke of storms, not as exceptions, but as realities. He spoke of houses built on foundations, not because storms might come, but because they would. Faith today feels hard because storms are constant. Economic pressure, emotional burnout, global instability, personal loss, all arrive without warning. The modern mind looks for systems, strategies, and shortcuts. Faith offers something quieter, steadiness. One of the hardest truths is that faith does not shield us from ambiguity. Jesus lived inside ambiguity. He loved those who misunderstood him. He trusted even when outcomes were uncertain. He remained rooted when abandoned. Faith modeled through his life was not certainty about the future, but faithfulness in the present. That is a demanding kind of belief. It asks us to remain grounded even when nothing feels resolved. Faith feels heavy today because it asks us to live with integrity in a fragmented world. To love in a culture that rewards indifference. To forgive in a culture that profits from resentment. To remain gentle in a world that equates hardness with strength. These choices are exhausting not because they are wrong, but because they go against the dominant current. The modern world often tells us that meaning is something we create alone. Jesus taught that meaning is something we participate in. That difference matters. When meaning becomes a solo project, failure feels devastating. Faith reminds us that meaning is larger than personal success or failure. It connects our lives to something enduring, something not entirely dependent on our performance. Faith also feels difficult because it refuses to rush grief. Jesus wept. He paused. He allowed sorrow to exist without immediately fixing it. The modern world has little patience for grief. It pushes us to move on, stay busy, stay positive. Faith gives grief permission to speak. That permission can feel painful, but it is also healing. Over time, many discover that faith feels hardest right before it becomes most honest. When inherited language no longer fits. When simple answers collapse. When belief must be rebuilt rather than repeated. This stage feels like loss, but it is often transformation. Jesus never asked for shallow agreement. He asked people to follow, to walk, to live differently. Following has always been harder than believing in theory. Faith does not demand certainty about everything. It asks for trust in something deeper than circumstances. Trust that love is stronger than fear. Trust that meaning outlasts chaos. Trust that even when the path is unclear, walking with intention still matters. In the modern world, faith may no longer dominate public life, but it still shapes private lives in powerful ways. It shapes how people endure suffering without becoming bitter. How they love without guarantee. How they choose hope quietly, without applause. These moments rarely make headlines, but they sustain humanity. Faith feels hard because it strips away illusions. It refuses to promise comfort without cost. It invites growth through honesty rather than escape. That invitation is demanding, but it is also deeply human. Jesus never offered faith as an accessory to life. He offered it as a way through life. And so faith continues, age after age, not because the world becomes easier, but because meaning remains necessary. The questions have not changed. Only the noise around them has grown louder. Faith still answers those questions the same way it always has, not with certainty, but with direction. If faith feels heavy now, you are not out of step with history. You are standing exactly where countless others have stood before you, between doubt and hope, between fear and trust, between what is seen and what is believed. And faith, quiet and resilient, continues to meet people right there. Faith keeps moving forward into the present moment, into the quiet spaces where people sit alone with questions they never post online and doubts they never say out loud. It moves into ordinary lives where belief is no longer celebrated, where choosing hope feels almost rebellious, and where trust must be rebuilt every single day. Faith survives here not because life is clear, but because meaning is still needed. In the middle of noise, faith becomes the decision to listen. In the middle of confusion, it becomes the courage to keep walking without having everything figured out. What Jesus showed was never how to escape the world, but how to live inside it without losing your soul. He did not remove pain from the human story, he gave it context. He did not erase fear, he gave people a way to face it. And that truth remains unchanged. Faith today is not about pretending things are fine. It is about believing that even when things are not fine, life still holds purpose. That even when answers don't come, presence still matters. That even when the path feels unclear, love, kindness, and hope are never wasted. Faith feels hard because it asks us to grow instead of escape. To stay instead of run. To trust instead of control. And yet, for those who continue, faith becomes less about certainty and more about peace. A quiet peace that doesn't depend on circumstances. A steady grounding that doesn't collapse when life shakes. A gentle strength that allows you to move forward even when fear whispers that you shouldn't. If you've stayed with this message until now, understand this deeply. The struggle you feel with faith does not mean you are weak. It means you are alive, aware, and honest. It means you are no longer satisfied with shallow answers. And that kind of faith, the kind that wrestles and still stays, is the kind that transforms lives slowly, deeply, and permanently. So as this reflection comes to rest, carry this with you. Faith is not about having everything solved. It is about choosing meaning over despair, again and again. It is about trusting that even in the modern world, even in uncertainty, even in silence, your life still matters and your story is still unfolding. If this message resonated with your heart, if it made you pause, reflect, or feel a little less alone in your journey, then take a moment to support this channel. Like this video so more hearts searching for meaning can find it. Share it with someone who might be quietly struggling with their faith. And subscribe to this channel if you want more reflections that speak to the soul, that explore life, belief, and hope with honesty and depth. This channel exists for those who think deeply, feel deeply, and still choose to hope. Stay connected, stay curious, and keep walking your path with courage. Faith may feel hard, but you don't have to walk through it alone.